What is up, everybody? It is Peaceful here. I am back, and we are going to be going over what I think are the three best decks to take to Infinite this month. Now, I'll go over why I think these are the best decks. These are not necessarily the best decks based on pure win rate, but they're some of the best decks based on cube rate, and the decks that I think are the most straightforward and easiest to pilot to get you to Infinite. Before we go any further, please, if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button. If you enjoy the video, hit the like button below and comment down below what other decks you think are good for getting you to Infinite. I will be doing a giveaway this weekend live on my Twitch/YouTube. We are actually streaming on YouTube now as well. So yeah, be looking out for those. And I will have some information up for you on that giveaway here on YouTube. So pay attention to that as well and make sure you're checking out the video so you don't miss the content. Without any further ado, let's go ahead and get into it. All right, the first deck we're going to be going over is InsheNaut. This is one of my favorite decks in Marvel Snap right now, and I think it's super underrated and super underplayed. So this is a deck built around the synergies between Magic, She-Hulk, and Hulk. So this is the list that I recommend. A lot of times people will cut one of the one drops, usually Misty Knight, and run just Sunspot and Nebula. I don't recommend that. I actually think it's super important you have at least one, but preferably two one drops early to get your scaling going. It's super important going into the late game. So this is the list that I like. Don't cut any of these cards, please. I think this list is actually pretty much ideal. We're going to go over why here in the next slide. So their game plan is basically you're going to stick your early scalers. So like I was talking about, you need your Sunspots, your Nebula, your Misty Knight. You want at least one of those every game, preferably two. Um, and make sure, just keep in mind, if you only have one and you have Hulk in hand, it is okay to skip turn one and play it on turn two so that you get that extra pump on Hulk. That's actually sometimes a big deal. You can get Hulk to 22 power a lot of times, and that's going to be pretty important in certain matchups. So keep an eye out for that. So you stick your early scalers, then you've got Magic plus Disruptive Element. So when I say Disruptive Element, you've got a bunch of them in this deck, and this is one of the huge advantages to this deck is that you have Armor, Cosmo, and Leech. All of these cards are super potent and really good into certain decks, and you get to play them for free because other than Leech, like Armor and Cosmo synergize very well with what you've got going on. They protect your Hulks. Armor can protect your one drops from things like Killmonger. There's a lot of Killmonger around right now. And you get to play them in a synergistic way where it actually helps your game plan as well. But they are just super good into the metagame. You're going to see with some of the other decks I have listed just how good they really are into some of the other decks that are seeing a ton of play. So definitely something to think about and to keep an eye out for. It's something that really helps if you can identify early what you're playing against. You can use your disruptive elements to snag those extra cubes, snap them early, and then hit them with the Cosmo or the armor or whatever it may be, and just wreck them. And it's awesome. So that's one of the huge advantages this deck has. So once you've got your one drops down, you've got your disruptive element in play. Now you are gonna you've played Magic. Now you've got that extra turn. You're going to skip turn 6, then you She-Hulk and play a big threat on turn 7. So this could be either Hulk, it could be Infinaut, and that's just generally going to be very hard, especially if you have a Sunspot in play. That's going to be very hard for your opponent to predict where all of your power is going. And generally, you can set it up to where you're going to win all 3 lanes pretty much no matter what and secure the victory. And I love this deck. I think this deck is really good. And there's just a few reasons why that I'm going to go over why this deck's so good. It's easy to play. Once you've got the hang of the play patterns, it's very simple to play, which is an underrated thing in Snap. One of the things that I really appreciate about decks like this, as opposed to something like Loki or Bounce or these other decks that have or Werewolf by Night decks. All those decks have all these really complicated play lines that what they do is they force you to spend your time figuring out how to play your cards optimally and give you less time to figure out what your opponent's doing, and B, whether you should be snapping, whether you should be retreating. This deck really, your play lines are going to be pretty straightforward. They're going to be laid out there for you. It's going to be pretty clear what you need to do, which means you get to spend more time figuring out what your opponent's doing and whether you should be retreating, whether you should be snapping, and that sort of thing, what lanes you should be focusing on, all that. It makes it much easier to play. So like I said, easy to snap. I think this is one of the most underrated things. There's actually uh, one of the things that I think makes this deck so good is that it is very, very straight. It's kind of like Ramp style of old, which Ramp isn't quite as good anymore, but Ramp was the same way where generally your play lines are so simple because you were electroing, you only could play one card, that it was very easy for you to figure out what you should be doing as far as snapping and retreating. more so than with some of the more complicated decks. This deck's consistent. You have 3/1 drops, so you're pretty likely to have at least one of them by turn two, which is super important. You got magic to extend the game. Even if you don't get magic, a lot of times you can still win with things, with like floating energy with Sunspot, and then playing She-Hulk on turn six or playing Hulk on turn six, whatever it may be, and still win a lot of games that way. It's just very, very consistent. I found this deck to be very effective, especially on ladder, because it's very clear, like I said, because it's so easy to play. It's very clear whether you should retreat very early. If you're missing your 1 drops and your opponent snaps, it's like, all right, I'm out. You got your 1 drops, you've got Cosmo, you got armor, you got magic, and you got this really sick curve that's going to just really stall them out. You got leech against, like, a negative deck. Like, all these things are going to really make it very, very consistent and easy to see what you need to do. So I love this deck. Definitely recommend trying it out. And like we talked about on the last slide, Leech, Cosmo, and Armor just win you some matchups. If you're playing against Destroy a lot, if you're playing against Surfer a lot, these cards are very, very good at stealing some wins where your opponent might think they've got you. So definitely recommend trying this deck out. I know it's not flashy or fancy, it doesn't have any new cards in it. It's been around for a while, but it got a lot better. Luke Cage got nerfed. He only protects one lane now, so you can, a lot of times your Cyclops is a lot better. There's just a lot of, this deck didn't rely on Chavez. A lot of the best decks were playing Chavez, and now Chavez is gone. Rest in peace, Chavez. As most of you know, she's one of my favorite cards. So sad to see her go. She might as well not exist anymore. They really, as Lammy said on his Twitter, they war song commandered my girl, and it's sad, but you'll notice the theme amongst the decks that I'm recommending. None of them played Chavez before, and that's, I think, a huge advantage, because that means those decks were already pretty well tuned. Whereas a lot of the decks like Loki and things like that, people are still figuring out the optimal lists without Chavez. So give this one a try. It's going to be a good one. Next up, Destroy. Now, I recommend the Deadpool Destroy. This has always been my favorite archetype ever since Nico came out. I think it's been by far the best performing one as well. And this is the list that I recommend. I haven't liked Taskmaster. I think Taskmaster and Zola are both very clunky to make work. And this is the list that I would run if I were to run Destroy. Now, let's get into why this deck is so good. All right. Game plan is pretty simple. You're going to buff your early Deadpool, then you're going to destroy it. If you don't hit Deadpool, you can also, buff up either your X-23 or your Wolverine. These are both acceptable things to buff up because they still get a little bit of advantage from being destroyed, because you get to keep the stats. So, you put your Hulkbuster on Wolverine and then Venom it, you're getting the Venom stats, but then you also get to keep the stats on Wolverine plus the +2 for it regenerating. So this is generally your early game. Get your cards that synergize with being destroyed: Deadpool, X-23, Wolverine, and destroy them. Ramping with X-23 can be very important, because you really, a lot of times on turn 6, want to be able to go null plus Deadpool. So try and have your lane set up in a way that you can get that X-23 buff on turn 5, because it can end up being very important for winning that lane on turn 6. Another minor thing just to note, this deck does really well at gaining priority, which you don't always want. So sometimes you do have to play in sort of an odd way against decks that are running Shadow King, decks that are running Killmonger, like, Surfer decks, in order to protect your Deadpools and stuff like that. So keep that in mind. It can be a very important part of this deck's game plan. Now, why is this deck so good? The favorable locations. I think so it's kind of become a meme among the community. Destroy just has a lot of favorable locations, like a lot, and it makes it a really nice deck to bring into the ranked ladder, where you don't have that opportunity to just leave for one and then figure out how to win in conquest. You got to win the game. It's a one of, you just got to go in there. So when there's a lot of, like, when there's like Death's Domain or Altar of Death, and things like that, it's really nice to have a deck that can play into those locations favorably, and sometimes get power there pretty freely with your regenerating cards. So it is a very nice perk. There are a lot of locations, and not just that, like the power scaling locations like Nidavellir are amazing for destroy decks, because things like Venom get those extra stats, and that helps grow your null, and then your null gets extra stats, and it just scales very, Sinister London, Bar Sinister, all these locations are great for destroy. And like I said, it's kind of become a meme. So it is a nice thing about running this deck. This deck is consistent. Again, this is a deck that wasn't running Chavez before. I actually think there is a world where maybe they should have been running Chavez and they just weren't, because a lot of people for whatever reason didn't like Chavez. But it's great because now we have optimized lists that people have been running for a lot of games that have been proving to be pretty consistent that aren't running Chavez. So it's a nice deck to bring into ranked ladder. I think a lot of times people overrate the power output. You know, something like Destroy can put out a pretty obscene amount of power with the right locations, but it also just on average puts out a decent enough amount of power that you're going to win a lot of games. It plays consistently. And like I said at the end, it can outstat most decks. This is generally true. Obviously, there are some decks that go over the top of you, but things like Surfer and stuff a lot of times have a hard time competing with Destroy when Destroy has even just a decent like medium draw. If you feel like you are getting outstatted on the regular by certain decks, you can sub in something like Taskmaster. You can sub in something like Arnim Zola, but I don't necessarily recommend that. I think this deck works better with the lower curve. It just makes it a little bit more consistent. If you draw death, you're going to be able to keep up with basically anything. And that's just one of the huge advantages this deck has over a lot of other decks. You know, there's other decks that may be flashier or play with more new cards. You probably were expecting to see Loki or Werewolf by Night on this list, and it's a little bit of a spoiler before I get to the last deck. They aren't, and that's because they're just harder to play. And a lot of times when you're bringing a really difficult deck to play onto ranked ladder, if you're not super familiar with that deck, you're going to lose a lot of win percentage just not being as familiar with the deck. And honestly, those decks to me, I've played them since the Chavez nerf, and they just haven't felt as consistent. So I wanted to give you all decks that I felt confident you could bring into ladder and win lots of games with. Last up, we're going to get to the deck that I actually used to hit day one infinite this month in Marvel Snap, and that is Shaw Surfer. So this deck is super cool. We're going to get into some of the basic game plans, but I wanted to go over why I love this deck so much. There's just a lot of cool things this deck is doing that have been fringe for a while, but there wasn't ever enough synergy to really make it work over a long period of games, and we finally hit that critical mass. We really have. So you've got your buff package, right? You got Okoye, you got Nakia, you got Forge. All these cards buff the cards in your hand and in your deck, and a lot of the cards in this deck are in here because they synergize with that so well. Now, the main cards you want to be buffing are Brood, Dakin, and Sebastian. All these cards are benefit, much more from being buffed to Brood. Every 1 point stat buff is actually 3 points of stat buff. Dakin, depending on how you curve out, it really scales exponentially. Something like Forge into Dakin, and then you Surfer, and then you Killmonger, and suddenly Dakin's like 20 power. It's just solos the lane by himself. Shaw, same thing. You get the Okoye buff, Shaw suddenly a 3/7. You get the Kia buff, suddenly he's a 3/10. Then you play it and you Surfer, and suddenly it's a 3/14. Again, like these cards can solo lanes by themselves, and then you just have the Sarah to really help you go over the top of your opponent. When this deck draws well, I think it outstats everything. When it has a normal, like a medium draw, you're probably you're going to struggle against certain decks, but it really does have a really insane power output. And let's kind of go over the game plan a little bit. Kind of touched on it a little bit already, going over the deck, but really your game plan is pretty simple. Early game, you want to buff cards with Nakia, Okoye, and Forge. So that's kind of your ideal curve as you go Okoye on 2, Nakia on 3, Forge plus one of your scalers on 4, Sarah on 5, and then triple 3-drop on 6. Generally ending with Surfer, but sometimes depending on if you have Dakin in play and Nova in hand, you might be going Killmonger last instead of Surfer last, and then Killmonger is your last card. It just depends on how everything pans out. Remember, it's really very situationally dependent. If you have a Dakin in play, sometimes it is correct to Surfer before you Killmonger, so you get the extra stats on Dakin, but that really depends on how much you need to win that Dakin lane, how much that Dakin power matters. Otherwise, obviously, you want to end on Surfer. But it's a really nice curve. Like I said, triple 3-drop on 6, or you go Nova, Shard, Killmonger, Surfer. That's another really powerful turn 6 play that is going to generally outscale whatever your opponent's doing. Make sure you have a plan going into your turns 4 and 5 so you know what cards you need to be playing. This deck can be a little trickier to play. That's one of the downsides to this one over the other two decks I listed, is that you really have to have your turns 4, 5, 6 sort of planned out as you're going. Like if you have Dokken but you don't have Killmonger yet, usually it's correct not to play Dokken and to go with something like Shaw or Brood instead. This deck is very flexible. Keep in mind, Cosmo, if you have priority going into turn 6 and your opponent snaps you with a Saren play, they generally have Shadow King. Like, that's my experience. It's like 99% of the time the reason they're snapping is Shadow King. So if you have Cosmo in hand, a lot of times that's going to get them. That's why my list is running Cosmo. This is actually my list. So funnily enough, I actually was playing, I bought the season pass and I grabbed the Shaw, added it to my collection, and I wanted to see what the deck builder would do. So I had it spit out a deck for me. And I'm sure a lot of people did the same thing because I've seen this deck running around a lot. But the deck that I'm playing is like only 2 cards different. I subbed in Nico and Cosmo for, I want to say, Mr. Sinister. And I don't remember the last card, to be perfectly honest with you. But it was worse. And I needed something to defend against Shadow King. So Cosmo has been really good for me. I think that's the key piece that this deck was missing from the build they gave me. But deck is very strong. Now let's kind of get into some of the reasons that I think it is very good. The power output's insane. On your nut draws, you are going to outstat or keep up with anything in the metagame. Tech card value, similarly to how we talked about with InsheNaut, I think this is a very underrated asset that some decks can have, where sometimes you're running tech cards, but they don't synergize with your game plan. Decks like Surfer get to run like Cosmo, Killmonger. These are cards that just have really good applications in the metagame, but also just synergize with your deck. Killmonger is a 3-drop. Cosmo's a 3-drop. Your Surfer buffs them, just like it buffs all the other cards in your deck. This is a really powerful ability to have with your deck to be able to play tech cards that actually synergize with your main game plan. It's pretty consistent. So I found this. I think I found the sweet spot with this. Like I said, the original deck I had pulled from the deck builder had Mr. Sinister in it, and I didn't like it. It didn't synergize with Surfer. It was really clunky to play a lot of times because a lot of times you have, on 2 you really want to be playing a Koi, and if you don't have a Koi, you want to be playing Forge because that's going to be better for your Brood. You don't want to be forging Mr. Sinister because you have other cards in your deck that are just way better to buff. So I think the sweet spot is 3 cards that want to be buffed, or that get extra benefit from getting buffed, because you really only need 1 per game. 2 is a nice bonus. But the deck is just very consistent. You're gonna get a lot of points. If you get Sarah, you're gonna be able to outstat basically anything, and it's really unpredictable. Especially if you have Sarah in play. If you have Sarah in play, a lot of times you can play like Brood, Killmonger, Surfer on the last turn. If you have Nova in play, you're just putting out an insane amount of points, and they don't know where they're going to go. Brood, especially if it's got a Nakia buff on it or an Okoye buff on it, it's just so much unpredictable stats, and your opponent doesn't know. That's one of the really cool things about this deck is because Nakia and Okoye buff cards that your opponent can't see, they don't know what the points are going to be, and they can't necessarily tabulate it. So like you play Okoye and Nakia, they might be like, well, is he going to play Brood? Is it Brood 4 power, or is Brood 3 power, or is it only 2 power? Like they don't have any way of knowing. And it makes it really hard to predict where your points are going to go, which gets you a lot of wins. Your opponent may calculate for a 3 power Brood, but they didn't calculate for you having a 4 power Brood, or for you playing Forge the last turn to make it a 6 power Brood, and suddenly, that Brood is like, basically a Hulk in a lane. It's just a lot of points that is really hard to know where they're going to go. So I love it. I'm actually going to include the game that I took this deck to Infinite with at the end of the video, so you can sort of check it out and see it in action. It was a really fun game. It was an 8-cuber, so that was pretty sweet. I hope one of these decks hits a chord with you. If you want to try out the new card, you've got a deck here at the end that you can try. If you're just looking for consistency, you've got Destroy. If you're looking for something a little more straightforward game plan, you got InsheNaut. Hopefully this has something for everyone. Let me know in the comments what other decks that you all have taken to Infinite, what decks you want to see. And that's it for today. I'll catch you next time. I'm going to call you Cal. Is that good? Not just yell at me. Yeah, we're doing quite well. Climb is going very well. You saw Chevelle? I bet that show was mayhem. I love Chevelle, man. That was one of the bands I was supposed to see. KO. Okay. Ooh. You just hit infinite at 969? Hell yeah. What did you use?
Friendly neighborhood Spider-Man here.
Spider-Man, Spider-Man. Does whatever a spider can. It was a lot of bots. It's been a lot of bots for me too. Am I going to get Shadow Kinged out of this Nether Sphere? I don't want to get Shadow Kinged out of this Nether Sphere. How do y'all feel about that? Cosmo, yeah, but where do we Cosmo? They can move Jeff and the werewolf out. If they have Shadow King, isn't that just the best place to play it, though? Because they can pull the werewolf back over?
Opponent snapped.
This looks pretty safe to me. And that's Shadow King. Oh! Get wrecked, nerd! Told you!
Victory.
Get wrecked, nerd! Let's go! It made sense to me. Like, with Werewolf, I think they always Shadow King left. Oh, yeah.